trauma and the effect on joint biomechanics. I'm just going to take a few minutes before we jump into it completely, just to cover a few little details. And while we wait for the last people to jump on, if you haven't opened your handout from the email, there's a handout tab next to the chat where you can download that now if you like. Also, as we're going through, it's really important to put your questions in anytime you want. So just make use of that chat the whole time. And then at the end, they'll all come up on the screen for me and I'll address all of your questions. So that's been really great these last two. We've had some really fantastic questions and I hope people have benefited from that chat. I've found it a lot of fun at the end. So and also just a couple of more things. We have still a lot more. We have 3 more sessions. And what we're trying to do here is I'm trying to give you tools that I feel are going to be valuable to any chiropractor. And certainly today, you're going to come away going, wow, this is going to change the whole way I look at joints. So once we understand how things work and the connections between things, it should make us better practitioners, whatever the technique you use. Now, yes, I do teach adjusting to neutral seminars. I do profit from that, I have to disclose. I make less out of seminars generally than I make out of my practice, so it's not really a motivational thing for me. I just want to share this information. But what we're doing now is also, we've been working on this for quite a long time, over a year now, is building a hybrid program. So in June, we're going to be launching an adjusting to neutral hybrid program. And what that means is we've taken our whole program we've been teaching over 3 seminars, expanded it, and basically I've rewritten the entire curriculum to cover everything that I think is essential to being able to be a great practitioner and to get the most out of adjusting to neutral and the specific tools that we teach. So what we've done is actually put the entire program into a online program. So in other words, all of the theory and all of the information that you need, the neurology and the biomechanics in great depth. I mean, we're starting here, we go into much more depth, is all going to be online. All of the assessments that we teach in the seminars will be online. We teach that with multiple view cameras, even first person views, so you can see how we do different testing as though it's you doing it, which is really good fun. And then all of the adjustments will also be online with different camera angles and great resources to be able to use that to learn and to use the techniques very effectively. So we teach that in a progressive way. So that whole program we've been building, and that will be launched in June. That won't be a free program, but what we will be offering is for the first group that goes through, the pilot group, we will be offering significant discount. So if it's something that you think you might be interested in, just stay tuned. We'll be sending you information on how that program works. We also call it a hybrid program because there are in-person seminars as well. So we have people come to 2 seminars. So if you've been to a seminar before, you qualify as doing the first one. The second seminar is specifically a validation seminar where we help you refine your tools, all of your understanding. So there's a written exam, there's verbal exam, as well as you have to show us that you know how to do the assessments, interpret your findings, and to be able to accurately and effectively adjust people. So once you can do that, we can certify you. So we've written this as a school would do this, and we hope to have a school online soon, or partnering with us to be able to validate that certification as well. So very exciting times ahead for all of us. I'm not trying to sell you necessarily on that. If you're interested, we'd be more than happy to welcome you. But at the same time, everything I'm offering here for free has been designed specifically to help nurture your practice, whatever that practice looks like. So I'm trying to keep it as neutral as possible. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and get on to the seminar. So with this one, what we're going to be doing is, let's see, where is, here's my window, and it's that one there. So what we're doing today is we're talking about trauma, we're talking about joints, and we're talking about biomechanics. And this is all the stuff that most of us probably didn't learn in school. I can say for myself, I didn't learn this stuff in school. It took 30 years of being in practice and studying to figure all this stuff out and to learn it. But I think we have some really amazing insights here, and I hope that you agree. I think it's going to be really, really good fun. So what we're going to be doing is talking about a specific case. I think is a great way to do this. When we're looking at trauma, we're going to be talking about a whiplash case. So if we are, as we're going through this, we're only going to talk about one case, which is the head being thrown forward and to the left. I'm not sure what it looks like to you, but this is my left side. So head thrown forward and to the left, the effect that trauma will have on the joints. So we're going to have a left anterior translational force through the cervical spine, as though something hit you from the side and your head went forward and to the left. So in a fraction of a second, there are forces passing through the joints, the joint capsules, into the muscles. And these muscles have been designed to resist those exact translations, but they're suddenly loaded beyond their capacity. So in other words, we're always being bumped in different ways all the time, but the difference with the trauma is that it's beyond our capacity to resist. So what happens next? In the tissues, there's stresses on the tissues, there's stresses, there's changes, effects on the nervous system and on the joint, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. So in webinars 1 and 2, we talked about, obviously, the tonic and phasic systems as being sensory, integrative, and motor systems that work in parallel with each other, but they have different functions. The tonic system is more associated with managing our position in space, and within the context of wherever we are in that moment in time. So as we move, it's managing position, okay? And has a holding function. And it's really, really good at doing that for a long period of time. So the tonic sensors are sensing what position we're in, and the tonic muscle fibers, those specific muscle fibers, are managing the holding of us in those positions. So that's position, okay? And those slow twitch muscles are really good at holding, whereas in the phasic system, we have sensors that are sensing the stretch or the acceleration of our body, the movements of our body, and responding with contractions of muscles that contract and accelerate our joints. So they're associated more with movement, and all movements are natural movements, are accelerated motions. So we also talked about some failure vectors. We mentioned a little bit about that. We talked quite a bit about phasic bracing last time. So when the tonic system isn't able to maintain the position or also to stabilize the joint, our phasic system will kick in to try to compensate. So that's kind of bringing us up to date. But now we're going to have the really fun stuff where we talk about how we get there in the first place. So we're going to talk about foundational biomechanics, the two motions of the spine, which are rotations and translations. We're going to talk about the instantaneous axis of rotation, which just means how a joint actually rotates, what's controlling the axis of rotation. And we're going to talk about the different muscles around the joints, the deeper intrinsic muscles and the more superficial extrinsic muscles. We're going to talk about the fiber types within each of these muscles and what those muscles are doing. They have different functions. So let's jump in. So here's what pure translation looks like. So pure translation is when one joint surface slides linearly relative to the other joint within a plane. So what that means is if we're looking at the facet joints, the facet joints are the plane, and a translation is a sliding within that plane. So the surfaces remain parallel with each other. As you have this gliding, you have a parallel sliding between the joints. So there's no rotation about an axis. The facet joints are moving in the same direction, okay? So here in this example, we're talking about left anterior. So the head and neck will translate forward and to the left, and that's the kind of our key direction. The facets are going to both move in that direction, forward and to the left. The translation is always a vector. So it's not a rotation, it's not an arc, it's a straight line. So that motion is like an arrow going through space, and you can move that arrow however you want to point in whatever direction you want it to point in. But that's what we mean by a vector. It's going in a specific direction. Okay. And then we have interesting things like LARPs and RALPs, which mean the paired functions of left anterior, right posterior translations, okay, and right anterior, left posterior translations, okay. LARP and RALP are super, super important for many reasons. One is, we discussed a little bit before, but when you move left anterior or right posterior, so here's the front of the spine, if we move left anterior, what will happen is the joint will slide in a straight line. It's a pure translation. It's just a straight motion in that direction, okay? If we try to flex, what's going to happen is we're going to flex, but we're also going to kind of tilt as well, okay? So there's another axis of rotation down here that's kind of rolling over a barrel, like you're sort of walking around a planet, okay? But the LARP and route planes are pure translations, okay? So that's kind of a key thing. So flexion extension, there's some degree of rotation, like you're kind of walking around the planet, whereas LARP and RALP are actually straight lines. So that's a very, very important key distinction. And sometimes people will say, well, who cares? When do I move my head like this and I move my head like that? Every time you take a step. When you take a step, if your left foot goes forward, what's happening? You're turning your body this way. And now, where is the relative position of your head to your shoulders? Your shoulders are here, your head is here. And when your foot hits the ground, your head is going to go left anterior. Okay? You're going to turn your body, your right foot's going to hit the ground, and your head's going to go right anterior, or the forces are going to throw your head right anterior. So these translational forces live with us with every single step. And we need to be able to manage those translational forces precisely to be able to measure how much force there is and to be able to respond with the appropriate amount of muscle contraction in order to be able to withstand that force. If we can't withstand that force, then the joint's going to move more than it should, which is exactly what happens. So that's, again, we're on to that in a moment. So let's look at what pure rotation looks like. So rotation is defined by an axis. So again, if we're looking at the facet joints, if we have the axis of rotation of the facet joints is actually the spinal canal, which makes sense because the spinal canal contains our spinal cord, and we don't want that getting chopped off in any weird way. Everything else should just be moving around it. So the axis, we don't actually have a pin there. There's actually a hole, there's a cavity. Okay, we don't want our spinal cord isn't the pin. Okay, we don't want any pressure on that. So we have to have the musculature around the joint controlling it and making sure that it maintains that axis of rotation. Okay. So again, it's not a structural axis of rotation, but it's a muscularly controlled axis of rotation, which is very, very key, which requires the muscles around the joint to be functioning appropriately, having the appropriate tone and reactivity. So the rotational plane is actually defined by the facets. So the facets define the plane of rotation. So as one joint slides up on its facet and the other one slides down, we have rotation of the zygapophyseal joints, and that's how we define what rotation is. That's a rotational plane. So the joints are not meant to open up and slam against each other like this, okay? So if you think you're going to be sort of laterally flexing someone, and you're just laterally flexing someone, you're just jamming facet joints together, okay? If you're just purely rotating someone, you're going to be jamming facet joints together, in a Cartesian way. We have to think about the rotation being within this plane of function. So the plane of function is like this, okay? So if we look at someone being upright, they're like this. The facets are actually at an angle, everyone should know this, about 45 degrees. It varies by each segment, but it's that plane which is defining where the rotation is. So again, next point is it's 90 degrees to the plane. And clinically, it looks like there's kind of two motions happening at once, because we like to define things in kind of Cartesian perspectives, here's this plane, and so on. But what we see the joint doing is bending like this, okay? So if I were to rotate my head to the left, we know that the cervical mechanics mean that my head is going to laterally flex to the left, but also rotate to the left, okay? But it's not two motions. It's not that you're laterally flexing, because we know that it can't just laterally flex. We know that it's not just rotation, because the facets will also bang into each other. What we're actually describing is just one motion between the two, whereas there's rotation and lateral flexion in a traditionally defined sense, but it's really just rotation. So as we turn, as we rotate our cervical spine, our chin will naturally drop down like that. So the lower cervicals move like that. That's pure rotation of our cervical spine. Um, when we're often describing that as coupled motion, but it's not two motions. It's just one motion. So um, let's see. And so here, again, these muscles are the thing that are determining that motion. So the instantaneous axis rotation is not a fixed structure. It's determined moment by moment by the balance and reactivity of these deep intrinsic muscles. Okay, so we're going to go into the intrinsics. When those muscles are balanced and adequately reactive, the instantaneous axis rotation sits where the joint's geometry requires. And when they're not, it shifts. So let's just kind of look at that for a moment. If these muscles that are around the joint are balanced, we'll see that the instantaneous axis is in the correct position. Okay, we'll see that rotation occurs on the intended axis, and that translation is resisted symmetrically as well. So if those deep muscles around the spine are working in balance, then whichever way the joint is being shifted, we should have balance of those muscles to resist the translations in every direction as well. We should have a normal arc of motion of the joint and normal proprioceptive feedback, because again, these are the muscles that are controlling the mechanics of the joint. So if the brain's telling it to move in a certain way, they should be able to respond appropriately and move that joint in that way. If the intrinsic muscles are out of balance, that's what we're going to talk about in a moment with a subluxation. You're going to have a joint that's subluxated, left anterior. The instantaneous axis of rotation is now shifting towards where there's greater tension. So if the joint is shifted this way and there's more tension on this side over here, then the instantaneous axis of rotation will pivot around that tension. Okay, the loose muscles will allow more motion and the tight muscles less motion. So that axis of rotation will shift from the middle laterally. Okay, so the rotation will occur around that displaced axis. Also, the translational resistance is going to be asymmetric. As we try to move it back towards neutral, we have muscles that are holding it here and not allowing it to come back to neutral. If we try to shift laterally in the same direction that it's subluxated, so it's subluxated this way to the left, we try to move it more in that direction, we'll see more motion. So there's less resistance to stop it from going further into that direction. And then that's where the proprioceptive errors are starting, because we simply don't have a response appropriate to the signal. So these muscle tensions in the joint disable the joint from being able to the muscles from being able to contract and move the joint appropriately. So let's just go into what intrinsics and extrinsics are. So by intrinsic muscles, we just mean the deeper muscles. That's all. Extrinsic muscles are the more superficial muscles, but there's patterns of how these muscles function and what they do and how they're controlled. Okay, so the intrinsic muscles are small muscles that are going straight into like individual joints. They are primarily slow twitch muscles. So again, remember, slow twitch muscles are controlled by our tonic system. The tonic system is maintaining our position and our stability. So when we talk about intrinsic muscles, we're also talking about joint stability and the positional control of that joint. When those intrinsic muscles contract concentrically, they'll actually draw the joint back to a neutral position, okay, that we call the closed pack position. During movement into a lateralized position, they're being stretched eccentrically, and they're going to give a braking force, a holding force. So in other words, when you try to move forward, they're not just going to let go. They're going to hold on, but allow it to move. So these muscles at the back here, they're going to allow that joint to move into flexion. So And again, they're controlling the position and the biomechanical control. They're also resisting translational gliding at that joint level. So each of these muscles, so I've named here multifidus, rotatorius, intertransversarii, interspinalis. These are the deepest muscles around the spine. Again, they're reflexively controlled. You can't sort of turn on multifidus between C3 and C4. You can't just think about it and do it. It doesn't work that way. They're controlled by reflexive systems. So if that system's working well and those muscles are adequately reactive, then they're going to be able to resist those translational motions as well. And again, they're joint specific. It's kind of working on one joint at a time. The tricky thing about this, though, is that these intrinsic muscles are being switched on, not specifically those muscles. So it's like there's no part of your brain that can turn on, even if you wanted to, in your brain to say, I want to turn up the tension on multifidus between C3 and C4 on the right because I just had this whiplash. Let me just turn up that muscle, turn up the gain, and bring it back to where it should be. That mechanism doesn't exist. The way that those muscles get switched on is in sequence with each other. We have things called central pattern generators, which are kind of some of the big drivers of this. And they rely on a communication from one joint to another, kind of like zipping activation back and forth. So in other words, what happens is as you tilt one way, you're going to activate the muscles at the top of your neck to start to bring your head back towards neutral. And if it doesn't come back, you keep going that way, what's going to happen is that alpha motor neuron is going to fire to you're going to fire to it also to an interneuron, which fires to the next alpha motor neuron down. So you're going to bring the next joint over as well. And if you're still going in that direction, you haven't come back enough, again, the process is going to repeat. And we call this a central pattern generator. It's like a little zipper that makes our spine bend and bring us back to neutral. And it makes that kind of snaking motion. And that's exactly how snakes and fish move, is through these central pattern generators. So there's the same mechanisms that exist in fish and in snakes still exist in us, and they are what activate these intrinsic muscles. They respond to gravitational inputs. So obviously snakes and fish are oriented differently to gravity than we are. So as soon as we orient to gravity this way, they take on a different role, but work in a very similar way. Hopefully not flopping around so much, but depends on whether it's Friday night or not. So extrinsic muscles they're larger muscles that are primarily associated with moving. They span multiple joints. So you have a muscle that's originating in one place and going into many joint levels. So when that muscle contracts, it's going to move multiple segments at the same time. They are predominantly fast twitch muscles, which means they're consciously driven. They're voluntary pathways, and you have voluntary control of those muscles. Again, this is phasically activated systems. Okay, so when they contract concentrically, they're going to move the joint away from the neutral position. So you see that there's sort of opposite functions in a way. If the extrinsics fire off without intrinsics, you're going to destabilize your muscle. You're going to, destabilize your joint. You need those intrinsics to be firing at the same time to allow a kind of a push and pull. So as your phasics are firing and pulling you away from neutral, your intrinsics are actually giving some degree of resistance to allow it to move, but not stop it from moving. So by stability, we don't mean it locks it. We mean that it works in conjunction with that motion, but it allows a little bit of a braking force and also control of exactly how that joint is going to move. So the extrinsics are again responsible for these large motions, but when our tonic system fails, as we discussed last time, these extrinsic muscles, or particularly the phasic muscle fibers, can be used as a backup to try to stop a joint from moving. So if there is a direction that our joint will move where it's unstable, it makes sense for our body, even if it's affecting many joints at once, to just contract a whole bunch of muscles to stop us from going into that unstable position, because we don't want our joint to move in a way where it's not being stabilized, because we could risk some damage to our spinal cord. That would be very bad, as we all know. So here's another key. With these extrinsic muscles, because they cross many joints, they can't replicate that fine translational control of the intrinsics. They're really designed to pull you away from neutral, but they can be contracted to keep you away from going in the other direction as well. So, but again, you don't have that fine degree of control. And when they contract, they actually put a lot of load on the joint as well, which is what contributes to rapid degeneration in the joints as well. So again, they cross multiple joints and again, move several segments at once. So this is why translation is so important. And we have to kind of reference this against the closed pack position. So just kind of go back to what we talked about before about closed pack positions. The mechanoreceptor density peaks at that neutral or closed pack position. So when we're in our anatomic posture, that should be all of our joints in the most stable position in our closed packed neutral positions. We have the highest concentration of receptors in that position, and that's for a reason, because we want to be in that position for many reasons. We're getting the most afferentation, but also as soon as we start to move away from that position, just small little perturbations, small little movements away from that, because there's such a high density of receptors, we sense it very quickly and our system can respond very quickly as well. Whereas once we move further and further away from neutral, there's fewer and fewer receptors that are being activated. And so the control precision is going to drop off. Our reactivity, if you will, of the entire system will start to drop off as we move further and further away from neutral. So if we want to be able to maintain stability, be able to maintain afferentation, be able to maintain the ability to stay upright in gravity, getting to and maintaining stability from that closed back position is absolutely vital. So the intrinsic muscles as well, like I said before, they're at their strongest mechanical advantage at the neutral position, because again, we said that they'll contract concentrically to bring you back to neutral, which means that when you're in that neutral position, all those muscle fibers are really highly approximated with each other. As soon as you move into, say, flexion or lateral flexion, or in the end range of a joint, you're going to be lengthening those intrinsic muscles, so they have less mechanical advantage. So the further you out to the side, the less capacity you have from a structural perspective of those muscles. If the muscles are not able to switch on as well, then that's sort of a perfect storm for re-injuring a joint. And that's generally what we see. People sort of bend over to the side, they pick something up and they put their back out, or they turn their head in one direction where it's unstable, and boom, oh, their neck goes out, and then they feel this incredible pain. So, those pains are because maybe the joint moved more than it should. But after that, you're going to have all this reflexive contraction, and then you're going to load the joint. It's been stressed and irritated, all that tension, the lack of motion. It's all recipes for acceleration of pain and pain sensitivities, which, again, is another subject. I'm sure you know a lot about that anyway. So managing translation precisely does have a direct effect on brain potentiation. So what I mean by that is when we're in that closed back position, again, we're getting a lot of quality information to our brain about where we are, but because those tonic receptors that are saying you're in the closed back position, there's so many of them. These receptors are power stations. Tonic receptors are power stations. Tonic receptors are constantly firing, telling us gravity is acting on you in this direction, constantly turning that stimulus into electricity. That electricity, that voltage, is a constant source of charging to your brain, and our brain knows that. Not only does it know it, it's how biology allowed it to develop. Because we started to become more and more upright, we started to get more and more voltage to these higher centers, and with more and more voltage, we could build more and more material. So evolutionarily, it's actually the afferentation of these joints and being able to extend and extend and extend and hit more and more concentration of receptors and have more perception of gravity and more afferentation that's actually creating enough electricity to drive these newer and newer parts of our brain. So we get all the way to prefrontal cortex. It's kind of the last evolutionary step. That's where all of our humanism is. So as we start to move our joints away from the neutral position, we're getting less and less activation of that prefrontal cortex. So what does it do? It makes us less human, People that are sort of flexed over like this, they're like zombies, you know? People get older, they get flexed, you know, and they get like this, and then they get grumpy and cranky, and they're like turn into awful people. They used to be lovely and jolly and happy and dancing, but the more they get flexed, the less affrontation they get, and the less stimulation you're getting to those newer areas that really need that. So again, sorry, I'm going on a little preaching moment there, but it's absolutely essential for our brain to get that power. Our neurons need constant activation, not necessarily to be switched on, but just a bit of, at least a little bit of an electrical charge to keep them keep them metabolically active and functioning. If we don't have that, what's going to end up happening is they're going to start to fail. They're going to start to die, or they're going to start to become unstable. So it's absolutely crucial for our sensory, integrative, and motor systems that we have this degree of affrontation. So anyway, I'll get off my high horse on that now, but I get very excited. Sorry about that. So here's what trauma is. This is what we're here for, right? So we're going to talk about what trauma is and how trauma affects the muscles. So we'll talk about the inverse myotactic reflex and the different muscle fibers and how those muscle fibers respond to traumas. So we're going to be looking at trauma as a neurologic event. Obviously, there is tissue damages that can happen. Tissues should be able to heal. We're not going into that at the moment. We're just talking about the effect that trauma has on our nervous system. So a trauma is a force greater than our capacity to resist. We're always undergoing forces pushing us in every direction, but our body should be able to sense that and to be able to respond. I remember a case I had very early on in my career of two people that were in a car accident, and a father and a daughter. And the father was fine, and the daughter was out of work for years because it affected her neck. The car was hit from behind, both sustained the same force, but the daughter was really badly affected, and her system was less capable of withstanding that force. So things that are traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for someone else. But we can encapsulate trauma by saying it's a force greater than your capacity to resist. Okay, so here we're looking at specifically in a whiplash, a high velocity, high amplitude load that the nervous system perceives as exceeding its capacity to resist. In other words, if you had a little bump, what will happen is your head will get thrown forward. But if it's not significant, your body will respond and make the muscles contract and hold your head up. You're not going to your head's not going to fall off. But there's a certain degree of force that is going to be beyond the limit, and your body's going to see that as a threat. So if that load is fast enough and beyond that capacity to resist, it's going to affect you in that way. So and also the muscles are the key thing that we're talking about here. So we're specifically talking about how your muscles respond to these forces. So when your head gets thrown forward, both your intrinsic and extrinsic muscles on the posterior, so we get thrown forward left anterior, the right posterior muscles are all going to be stretched at every level, intrinsic, extrinsic muscles, okay? But the slow twitch intrinsic muscles are the ones that are going to be able to resist that translational force better than the extrinsic muscles. So they're really going to take a pretty heavy hit with this. So how they respond is going to determine what's going to happen to that joint in the long term. So it's not just the tissue injury. Tissues can heal, but the muscles, specifically these slow twitch muscles, can have a long-term effect. We're going to get into that very, very shortly. So the joint's vulnerability begins at that muscle level. So a joint with intact intrinsics and an ideally modulated nervous system can absorb considerable force, like the father in this example. A joint whose intrinsics are caught in this inverse myotactic reflex cannot. So where that threshold is another discussion. We do that later. It's not relevant right now, but just to understand that if someone has an inverse myotactic reflex, it's going to switch off some muscles. So if we look at how stretch is being perceived, we have our normal muscle spindle response, which is, we call the myotactic stretch reflex. And what that means is just at a normal type of stretch, our body should sense the stretch through the muscle spindle and contract. It's a reflex we use all the time in every moment of our lives, particularly if we're walking. When you take a step, your quadriceps is going to stretch. It's the myotactic reflex. It's going to help you contract that muscle again so that you don't collapse. It's going to hold you up and actually contract to propel you forward into the next step. So we use reflexes all the time just to do normal stuff. And so kind of low and moderate normal stuff is being handled by these muscle spindles and this myotactic reflex. The Golgi tendon organ is operating at the same time. So it's just like we were saying before, muscle spindles are sensing stretch. That's a phasic function. Golgi tendon organs are sensing the load. Okay, that's a tonic function. So they're sensing the load intensity. So they're sensing the weight of your body. So the muscle spindles are going to make fast twitch muscles fibers contract. The Golgi tendon organs, when you take a step, are going to sense how much load is increased. There's an increasing load. The load's here, 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 and it's going to sense that through the Golgi tendon organ and activate more and more slow twitch muscle fibers. So when you're walking, you're using more slow twitch fibers. When you're running, it's more of a proportion of fast twitch fibers, okay? But they're both working at the same time, just in different proportions. So at a high velocity, the Golgi tendon organ is going to get a huge barrage of stimulation because it's not because there's more stretch, but because there's more intensity. Okay, so it's a high degree of a high velocity and high load. And what will happen is you do get a spindle sensation, but it's too fast for the muscle to contract to try to resist it. But when you have this very, very fast load, it becomes a tonically biased input. Okay, so again, the Golgi tendon organs are tonic sensors. So very, very fast stretch is going to create a dominance of inputs to our brain from the Golgi tendon organs rather than from the muscle spindles. And when we have that huge Golgi tendon organ hit, that big, big stimulus from a big, fast stretch, we're going to stimulate this reflex cascade here. So the Golgi tendon organ is going to fire. That load is going to, your body's going to sense that, wow, this load is so big. This isn't my normal deal where I'm going to make the muscle contract like I normally would. I need to do something else. So if you had a very big stretch and the muscle were just to contract super hard, you would rip the muscle. So there's a physical limit to what muscles can do as well. There's a graduated, modulated limit, but then there's a physical limit as well. So if we're going to exceed that limit, our body has to use the inverse myotactic reflex to switch the muscle off. So it will command it to release. It's a protective reflex. And so now that muscle is in that moment has been switched off. It cannot contract. It's impossible for it to contract. And that's how we essentially save muscles. So the recovery from this inverse myotactic reflex, this is actually happening to both muscles, to both slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers, but the recovery is different. So with our fast twitch or phasic systems, the recovery is minutes to hours. So, you could have a fall. People have experienced this. You fall down and you're like, oh, my arm feels so heavy. Oh, I can't lift my arm. It's because both slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers have been switched off by that fall. Within a few minutes, you'd be like, oh, okay, all right. Yeah, I think I'm getting it back. Okay, yeah, all right, now, okay, I'm back. Yeah, I'm fine. But what we don't realize is that the tonic fibers may still not be contracting. We may have lost stability in that joint. So let's dive into this. So the fast twitch fibers will recover in a few minutes to a few hours. So we have what we call the gamma motor neuron system that's going to kind of set that sensitivity of those fast twitch fibers, and that will recover quite quickly. So again, they're under conscious control as well. So I think that conscious control is actually helping to reset that gain or reset that change in the system. In the slow twitch fibers, however, the recovery is weeks to months. This is what our literature tells us, weeks to months. So you have that whiplash, you'll be able to move your neck, a few minutes later, you might feel, oh, you feel weird. But then after a few minutes, you're like, okay, I think I can move it, but something feels a little weird. The next day, you're really going to notice it because those slow twitch fibers are still going to be switched off. It's going to take weeks or months before those muscles that are resolving that translation that's happened can switch back on again. But in reality, we actually see it lasting for months or years. Sometimes it could be a subluxation could be there the whole of someone's life, and we're going to get into that in just a moment as well. So the slow twitch tonic fibers operate on a continuous basis, and their gamma motor neuron drive resets takes longer to recalibrate. Okay. So next slide is, so here's what happens after the joint trauma. We're talking about muscle failures, antagonists, the instantaneous axis rotation, how that shifts, and the effects on proprioception. So if we're looking at whiplash again, what happens to the muscle? So the force is left anterior. You're going to see that the translational force is going to stretch the right posterior muscles, all of those muscles. But again, the fast twitch or extrinsic muscles will be able to recover quickly. After the whiplash, these intrinsics will not. So they're the ones that are meant to resist that, and they won't be able to. So again, inverse myotactic reflex is going to fire because of the GTO dominance. Those muscles are switched off; they can't reset, and the joint will translate now left anterior. So that particular joint that's been traumatized in a left anterior position will be more left anterior. We don't have muscles that can draw it back. Those muscles have been switched off. So that's kind of the beginning of our subluxation. In the aftermath, what ends up happening is, again, those muscles that are stretched, the right posterior intrinsic muscles like multifidus, multifidus is a really major one for drawing our head back to the neutral position from left anterior, is now less reactive. So that's what we mean by that is it's like, you could say the tone has dropped. But really what we're saying is that after the inverse myotactic reflex, the multifidus muscle has a lesser capacity to contract. In other words, our brain will be telling it to contract at a certain rate. It'll say, give me 2 kilos of force, but the gain has been decreased. What that means is that now it says, give me 2 kilos, it gives you 1. So the decreased reactivity means it doesn't react as the brain is telling it to react. So we can say a decreased reactivity or a decreased gain. It's the same thing, okay? So also, normally when that muscle will contract, it will inhibit its antagonist, okay? And you should sort of happily be jogging through life with every muscle working with its antagonist to keep you happy and balanced and safe, and the joints moving exactly as they should. Post-trauma, those muscles can't switch on, so they can't switch off their antagonist, which is going to make that antagonist muscle less inhibited and create more contraction. So what will happen is that will contract. As it stays contracted over time, its contraction will further inhibit the one that's been traumatized and switched off. So that's what kind of locks our subluxation in. And I think that's probably a big reason why we see this lasting for weeks or months. I don't think it's just simply a biological element. I think that what we're seeing is just purely what's happening in terms of the chronicity of that that antagonist contracting and further inhibiting the traumatized muscle. So now the joint is actively held away from neutral. We can see this. I mean, it's easy. You palpate someone's spine, you see it's not in a neutral position. That's kind of the definition, right? So that now that joint can't be held and checked. The muscles are shortened, pulling it further into that direction, and it's so the joint is simply failing to come back to neutral. So not many people have talked about it in this way. I'm sure people have, but this is something that feels very, very clear to me, that what we need to be paying attention to is how effectively that joint can come back to neutral. If it can come back to neutral, there's no muscles resisting it coming back to neutral, then that should mean that all of those intrinsic muscles around the joint are at a equal and balanced state of reactivity, which should mean they should be stable, they should be biomechanically functioning well. So to me, that feels like it's kind of the thing we want to be looking at. And translation is more primary than rotation. Now, rotation is definitely a key, and it's definitely going to be affected by this, but it's the translational resistance that's the biggest problem. And that's why when we teach the technique of adjusting to neutral, we're really focusing on a translational thrust. So the joint's being actively held away from the neutral muscle by the unopposed tonic muscle. Okay. So here I just said the previously traumatized right posterior muscle in reduced reactivity, and it can't contract against this. So it cannot overcome the shortened antagonist, and it cannot bring the joint back home, back to neutral. So I think I've hit that enough times now. Let's just look at translation and rotation now. So with those intrinsic muscles in balance, the instantaneous axis shifts towards the side of tension, that's left anterior. Now every movement that is now going to trace an arc around that shifted axis, okay, around that tension. So that's going to have an effect on our, not only the way the joint is moving, but the signals coming back to the brain will be telling it, expecting it to be in a certain position and say, I want you to rotate to the right and expect it to move in a certain way. But if it's like this, the muscles aren't going to be able to contract and move it that way. It's going to move in an awkward way. So the feedback to the brain is going to be thrown off too. And we'll cover that in 1 second. The translation resistance is now weakest in the direction of the original trauma. So when that happens, we're not going to be able to stop the joint from going further into that direction of the trauma, okay? So we're going to be talking about the position signal, balance, congruence, and decalibration. So we're kind of using a few different words to describe different things that happen in our spine when we have a subluxation. So at that joint level, between left and right intrinsic muscles, if they're firing an active asymmetrically, they're out of balance with each other, okay? So the position signal is skewed, it's not representing true neutral, okay? If we look at it in terms of what's happening between the joints, some joints are working well and then other joints aren't. You know, sometimes you could have more than one subluxation, it's possible. And now there's different inputs coming from different joints. And that's what we call congruence, okay? Or what I call congruence. And decalibration is kind of another concept on top of that. Decalibration means not only the joints decalibrated with each other, but they're also decalibrated with other sensors. So we have our vestibular inputs and our proprioceptive inputs, okay, and our visual inputs, okay, they're all giving input into our brain about where we are. So if they don't agree with each other, you become very decalibrated, and one system can affect another. So very often we see people with what look like vestibular problems, but they're actually proprioceptively driven. But because this system is being stimulated in a way which is decalibrated, we start to see these types of problems. So this is just let me quickly buzz through this because I still have a bit more to cover. So here's the way that efference copy works. Is basically what happens is every time your body says move in a direction, it sends a command and it keeps a copy of what it said to do. And then it waits for the body to do it and waits for the sensory system to give information and say, and to confirm and say, yes, I did exactly what you said. So it says, I want you to rotate your head to the right, and what happens is it sends that signal. The muscles should, if they're appropriately reactive, they should be able to contract and move exactly as the brain said, and as that joint moves exactly as it's supposed to move, the feedback from the sensory system goes back to the brain, and your brain compares the command with the feedback. And if it matches, then we say, that's great, that's perfect, there's no problems. But if we have a subluxation and the brain says move this way, and it moves in a different way, a different arc, it doesn't match that prediction. And then you have the command and you have the feedback that says, I'm somewhere, I'm over here now. I'm not here, I'm over here. It's just going to say where it is. And that mismatch we call a proprioceptive error. Okay. So what does this do in the brain? Well, we talked before about the tonic system and how these constant position sensors are activating specific neurons in our brain associated with the position of every joint in our body. So every joint has like a whole bunch of neurons that are able to tell our brain exactly which position that joint is in. And as we move through each of those positions, we're going to be able to activate each of those neurons in these mapped out areas in one joint, in the joint above it, in the joint above it. And they're all mapped out through the brain and all kind of stacked next to each other. So our brain understands that where each joint is and each individual joint is, and then it can actually assess, across multiple segments of the brain to see if they're all in line with each other. When you have a subluxation in the brain, what it's doing is it's skewing those maps and kind of spreading that distortion throughout more areas, because if one joint can't get into a position, it's going to limit the motion of the joints above and below as well. And the effect in the brain is actually going to kind of spread out this skew of the map of not knowing where you are when you're in a certain position. So that becomes really vital when we're testing people, because you can actually position their head in different ways, and depending on how their body responds is going to tell you what's actually happening in these maps in the brain. So we can actually assess brain maps and the integrity and the quality of these maps from a clinical perspective, and that's absolutely vital, because that's going to be our best source of information about what we need to fix. We can't just rely on muscle tensions, and I'll explain why in a moment as well. But this is a really, really key component, and I don't think I certainly was never taught this in chiropractic school. I learned this from Dr. Carrick and from reading some really awesome books about neurology. That this is how the system works, just very simply. Okay, we need to pay attention to these maps, and again, the tonic system is building these maps. The subluxations are screwing them up. Okay, just remember that. That's your takeaway point. So here's another key element we're going to get into in more detail next time as well, or maybe the time after. We're talking about the autonomic effects of what happens, but at least at a primary level, when the joint moves wrongly, firstly, it's a structural threat. So our body has to respond by doing something, and that's what's driving the compensation patterns we talked about last time. But at the same time, a threat is a threat, and we have to respond to a threat appropriately. Any threat to our integrity of our system is going to activate our sympathetic system. So any joint that is giving information back to the brain that says, I'm not where you told me to be, the brain's gonna go, what the hell? Seriously? This is bad news. Whoa, I got to pay attention to this. And it starts amping up your sympathetic system. That means it's going to increase your reflexes. It's going to increase muscle tensions. It's going to drive your vascular system, drive your cardiac system, drive your breathing, and your pupils are going to dilate. And you're going to feel stressed and anxious because your system is constantly being driven. So a subluxation can cause a sympathetic response. So we know this, we see this, we adjust people. They feel better. Why? Because suddenly you're not getting those error signals. We've done something good for them. Okay, absolutely, we've done something great because we've taken that stress signal away. Okay, so really, really, really key component, but we have to remember that is coming from the joint, and this is why. Okay, so I really need you to understand that. And why is it seeing it as a threat? Because the joint is unstable, not just because it's moving badly, because there's certain directions you move into that are triggering that response. Sometimes people will move in a way and they, oh my gosh, my body just felt so hot. Oh, I felt like chills on my body when I moved this way, because the body is sensing an imminent threat instability. So here's the full compensation picture. Just to tie the last two seminars together with this, we have a trauma. The trauma is a force beyond our capacity to resist. It's going to activate the inverse myotactic reflex, which is going to make a muscle switch off. Okay, that's going to create an asymmetry of those tonic muscles that are stabilizing the joint. That asymmetry of those deep intrinsic slow twitch muscles is going to, because those muscles are responsible for the mechanics, is now going to shift the instantaneous axis of rotation. In other words, where is the joint rotating from? It's rotating from wherever the tension is the greatest. If it's balanced on both sides, it's going to be in the middle. If it's on one side, it's going to shift that around that way. That's going to create also an altered arc of rotation, and it's also going to create a vector of failure in that same direction as the trauma. So the vector of failure is the same thing as the vector of trauma. Now the joint's moving in different directions more than it should and giving different proprioceptive feedback to the brain. Brain's still sending signals to do stuff. If it can't do it, it gets these errors. The errors are driving the alarm signals. The alarm signals are stressing our sympathetic system, but also priming our phasic system for phasic bracing, okay? But the phasic bracing isn't a perfect solution because it crosses many joints. It doesn't do the same thing to draw the joint back to neutral. It loads the joint, it puts more stress in the joint, accelerates degeneration in the joint, and it's not precise. It's not a precise compensation. So it's not going to be the best way to create a long-term response. So I'm just going to touch on that just a little bit more for a second. The intrinsics are joint specific. The extrinsics are multiple joint. So that's why you don't have that degree of specificity. Remember as well, the intrinsics are driven by slow twitch fibers and the tonic system. So they're responding to gravity. They're responding to the load on our system. The extrinsics are responding to stretch. So it's movement. It requires movement to switch those muscles on. But the phasic bracing is kind of coming in underneath that and trying to turn that muscle on at the same time that your body's also trying to operate and make it move and relax. So you have one muscle, these phasic muscles trying to do this double duty, and it can't do it very well for all of those reasons. But again, we don't have that specificity of control of the extrinsic system either. And again, it's also not responsive to gravity. So when it switches on, it's on all the time. Your tonic system will respond to gravity. When you're upright, more tension, more tone, that's good. When you lay down, it can turn it off, it's efficient. The phasic bracing, it isn't. When it switches on, it's tight 24/7. You're sleeping with it, you're waking up with it. It's tight all the time. You lay the patient down on the table, if their muscles don't relax, that's phasic bracing, okay? And you'll see it sometimes all over their whole body, sometimes one side of their body, sometimes one muscle group. We know all the patterns, but that's what's happening. So when we see that that the extrinsics are firing to compensate, the result is messy. It creates patterns of muscle tensions that you can't just sort of say, okay, well, if it's the levator or scapulae, it's this. It doesn't really work that way. It's your body's going to use whatever it can, depending on whatever vectors. It's going to hit a whole bunch of different joints. You're not going to be able to look at phasic muscle compensations and figure out where is the problem, okay? So the assessments have to be able to be detailed enough to figure out which joint is failing and so which level is failing and in which specific vector is it failing. So we do have tools, and I'm going to give you all those tools for free. So please, after today, at the end of the talk, you can register straight away for the next one. I'm going to give you all of that stuff for free, okay? So this is really, really vital. And again, you can use this with any technique you want, but once you understand this, it'll be very crystal clear for you. So these are the questions we've answered. We're going to get onto the Q&A in just a moment. So here's the principle of adjusting to neutral. So if the problem is a slow twitch tonic muscle held in a reduced reactivity with its antagonist shortened and the joint locked in that direction, that's our subluxation, then the solution must be to work at that exact level. It must be joint level specific in a precise vector. Now, here's the key about what we do. We're talking about trauma as being a high velocity force that's activating a Golgi tendon organ and stimulating the inverse myotactic reflex and making a tight muscle or a muscle less capable of contracting. But that's our chiropractic superpower as well. We can use the inverse myotactic reflex. It's exactly what a chiropractic adjustment is. It's like the inverse myotactic reflex, but the good guy, we're the hero, because we're coming in there and going, okay, well, now we see what a muscle that's tight. We can just stretch that tight muscle and we can make it relax. But we have to be very specific. We can't just take the whole neck and go 7 on each side and think, okay, you're fine now. What you've just done is turned everything off. You turned all the muscles off, okay? You've reduced all their tension. And now the brain has to kind of figure out how to switch stuff on. But if we've done that to the intrinsic muscles too, which we probably have, because we're end-ranging it, we might be actually destabilizing the joint even further. So we have to be very, very careful with this. Now that you know this, you have to apply that thinking to how you're approaching this. So there's many, many ways of doing this well. Adjusting to neutral technique is not the only way. We teach many, many things as well. It's not just adjusting, there's lots of rehab too. But there's many, many ways to be conscious and cognizant of these issues and to be able to take that into account when we're addressing our patients. So a high velocity, low amplitude force delivered delivered opposite to the vector of failure, so that's the vector of failure, will drive the joint back towards neutral. And as it does, the tight antagonist uh, the, will basically switch off. You'll stretch it, and that, if it's at a sufficient magnitude, you're going to trigger the inverse myotactic reflex to make that muscle switch off, and now it will stop inhibiting the muscle that was originally traumatized. And if it's working well, we should see that that muscle should be able to switch back on more effectively and provide better stability in those translational vectors and be able to manage rotation much better, which is generally what we see. We adjust someone with adjusting neutral, the joint is more stable, and the biomechanics returned very quickly. As well, that phasic bracing will drop away as well. So this is basically how we're doing everything. So the joint has the opportunity for the first time since the trauma to return to neutral and to hold. So in the next webinar, we're going to talk about how to find that vector and how we would typically adjust in that vector as well. But I'm going to keep this in a very general perspective. So not just how we do it with adjusting to neutral, but how anyone can do it. You can use Gonstead, you can use lots of different things. But we just have to refine our treatments in order to be able to do that. So I'm just going to quickly run through this. So the first, we define the trauma. That's a high velocity load perceived as exceeding resistance capacity. It's a neurologic event, not just tissue. The inverse myotactic reflex is happening because of GTO dominance and high load intensity makes muscle relax and the joint translates. But again, we can use the inverse myotactic reflex to translate the joint back to neutral. We have this fiber type asymmetries. So there's a difference in the effect with slow and fast twitch muscles. We also see the antagonist locking. We see that the vector of trauma is also the vector of failure of the joint. And we also see the proprioceptive consequences of that. The balance problem happening in the muscles of the joint, the congruence between one joint and another, and the decalibration in our proprioceptive system. And those movement mismatches are breaking down the maps and our abilities to compensate. So that's as much as I wanted to tell you today. I think I managed that in an hour. So hopefully that was interesting to you. And I'm just going to close the screen share and we can go to some questions. So they should pop up in a second. Also, if you want, I see some people already registering, so go ahead and jump on that, hit that button straight away, and make sure you get your spot. So Clive asks, are similar neural mechanisms involved in low velocity, low amplitude onsets? Wow, great question. Really, really good. Like that. Things like recurrent microtraumas, repetitive strains, or adverse ergonomic loads as hysteresis, tissue creep, rather than injurious forces affect joint integrity. Wow, my hair standing in there. That was really good. Great question, Clive. Love it. We could talk about this for hours. Let me just hit a few of these things because it's a really, really good question. I love that. So things that are tonically biased are things that will change our system. So we've talked today about how a high velocity stretch will create an inverse myotactic reflex, but that's because it's a tonic bias. Okay, that very high velocity, high load is going to stimulate the tonic sensors, the Golgi tendon organs, and their response is in that moment to create a long-lasting change in the system, at least as far as the slow twitch fibers are concerned, which they're directly wired to. When we have something that's happening very, very slow or a load over time, that's still affecting the Golgi tendon organs and can start to shift what the baseline output is. So anything that's going to change our system is going to be happening through tonic biased stimulation. So a trauma is a tonic bias because it's very, very fast. Okay, it's beyond the normal speed. If it's below the normal speed, or it's just stationary load, that will also shift our tonic baseline. So really, really good question. Absolutely, everything you're saying I completely agree. And it's happening because of now we understand what's happening in atomic and phasic systems. Um, and yes, it's creating creep and so on. But essentially, what we're looking at probably is a tonic system that has been less reactive. Probably what we're seeing is some trauma that's made it less reactive. And now, because it can't contract, that constant load on that system is starting to stress other tissues as well. And that's what you're talking about here. So there's probably some trauma that's made someone more sensitive to that load, which is then furthering and accelerating and creating a greater spread of injuries. So, but yeah, really, really good question. Thanks for that, Clive. It's excellent. Jonas says, would a subluxation in the lumbar region affect the brain body as much neurologically as a subluxation in the cervical region? Another great question. The typical idea is probably less, but we can hypothesize and talk about this for a long time. One answer is it's less because there's a lesser concentration of receptors in the lumbar region. That's going to have a lesser consequence from a proprioceptive error perspective neurologically and how it might be affecting all these maps and so on. However, if you have a subluxation in the lumbar spine, um, what's going to happen is it's going to change the way your whole body is moving now as well. And you're going to have compensations, and all those compensations are going to change inputs to every part of your body. So, if you're looking at it in a full biomechanical perspective, then yes, lumbar subluxation would be affecting you neurologically in a big way. But it's really when we're looking at the biomechanics, I think that has more of a dominance, or it's kind of where that conversation branches off. Uh, However, what I will say is uh, most of the time when I see someone with a lumbar subluxation or some weakness in their lumbar spine, I'm probably going to see a failure of a cervical joint in that same vector of failure as well. And so that's kind of interesting in one sense, but it's also very clinically relevant as well, and gives us some direction with our treatments. Because if we find, like I find all the time, people with weakness in their hips and their low back, we adjust their neck and suddenly their back is strong again. So it's about turning that whole system on, because remember, these muscles that are stabilizing your neck are wired to the same circuit as the ones in your lumbar spine as well. And like I said, we have central pattern generators that are firing from one to the other. We talked about this last time, is that if the joint is subluxated at one level, if you can't, if you're tilting in one direction and your body has to bring you back, what's going to happen is your body's going to say, turn on these muscles to try to bring you back. But what will end up happening is if they can't switch on, they can't send the signal to the next muscle and the next joint down below. So what we're going to end up with is a weakness of every joint below that subluxation failing in that same vector. So you could have, again, a cervical subluxation in one direction that's creating a weakness posterior right, and then the person will bend left anterior, and if they have posterior right, failure of posterior right intrinsics to stabilize their low back, then they're also going to injure their low back as well. So it's really important to look at the spine, at the whole cervical spine as well. And again, one more thing on that, just quickly, is that sometimes people come in with a super hot low back, and what do? I adjust the neck. Okay, you adjust your neck, your back's going to feel better. So if we do it well, we should see big changes in lumbar stability just from working on the back as well. But obviously, we definitely work on the back too. So next question, Dennis says, how are the joints of the upper cervical spine affected? So great question, Dennis. Thanks for that. We cover this more in the course. I'll try to cover it if we can. But the upper cervical spine can also fail in extension quite frequently as well. So we see upper cervicals failing in flexion, left anterior, right anterior, but they can also get affected by posterior whiplashes as well, because they're designed to do all of that motion. A lot of that nodding motion is happening in your upper cervicals, and a huge amount of that Cartesian rotation is happening in the upper cervicals as well. So yes, absolutely, it can be affected. Um, Especially when we start looking at kind of the complexes. We're doing biomechanics version 1. It's like, this is basic baby biomechanics now. But when we start looking at the details of how our joints actually move, we have different things happening at different levels of our spine. So like I said, when you have true rotation of your cervical spine to the left, your chin goes down. But when we say rotate, we think of the chin being up. So what's actually happening is from C2, 3 down, you're rotating this way. And what happens is in order to keep your chin up, your upper cervicals are moving into extension, translation, and right lateral flexion to keep your chin up. So when I turn my head to the left, my upper cervicals are moving back and to the right, and my lower cervicals are moving forward and to the left. So it gets really complicated. But there's super cool ways that we can figure that out. And I'm going to actually touch on a lot of this in the last module. We're talking about P1 tests. So make sure you come to that one, Dennis, and I'll explain that in more detail. Thanks for that question. Simon says, does this style of chiropractic work within a preventive well-being model of care? Yes, absolutely. Most patients I see day to day have not experienced an old or recent physical trauma, okay? Typical causes of neurobiomechanical dysfunction presentation is because of ongoing postural and emotional stressors. Okay, so let's break this down. A lot of stuff in that question. I really appreciate that, Simon. So yes, it does fit within a preventative model. What I would say is that um, whereas most chiropractic sessions will start with several weeks or maybe even a few months of getting someone back on track and out of pain and getting the joints functioning again and getting all the other muscles that were tight to relax and getting them feeling generally good, we take maybe several weeks to be able to do that, and then we get them onto a wellness model where they're having regular checks. With adjusting to neutral, what we see is much faster results. So it's usually 1 to 2 visits. It's usually one visit. Honestly, one visit, we should see them functioning quite well. Second visit is just to check and see if there's other joints above or below that primary area, and we clear those up as well. So usually within the first 2 visits, we see people doing very, very well. Obviously, there's super complex cases, but in general, that's what we're seeing. So what we do is we get people so that they're functioning well, get rid of all of any sort of muscular issues as well. Generally, the phasic stuff will melt away. It might be adhesions and other things you need to fix and tension on ligaments and so on. But we can clear that stuff up pretty quickly generally if the joints are stable and biomechanically functioning well. So from that point, what we do is get people onto performance. So we say, if you just want to be out of pain, then that might be enough for you. But what people usually want is they say, wow, I feel so good. Where else can we go? And in a sense, if you're selling something, you're selling performance. And we're saying, look, okay, now you feel better, you're out of pain, but how about some more function? How about some more strength, some more flexibility, some more endurance? And then we get them onto our performance program. So we're not really covering that. I'll try to bring some nuances of how we do that. But once we resolve the joint stability and get the mechanics functioning well, again, that's a very, very quick process with adjusting to neutral, and obviously getting out of pain very quickly as well, we get onto performance. So most people that I'm seeing on a regular basis are performance patients. But what this does to your practice is it will shift your practice to a lot more new patients. So I would say I spend most of my time with new patients because we're fixing people pretty fast. And the people that are coming back are people that are there for performance. So just more on that question. Oh, it just disappeared there. I can't remember what the last things were, but there was, we were just talking about how you're managing it. I think we sort of covered what you're saying there. So next question. Let's see. So Jake says, if a subluxation is left anterior, will it palpate as restricted from left to right? And why does it sometimes not clear very well? Okay, so now if we understand that the joint is stuff like this, it's a great question, Jake. So it's stuff like this. If you palpate from left to right, really what we're doing, the way that we adjust, or sorry, palpate with adjusting to neutral, I'll show you next time, is what you're doing is actually moving the joint away from neutral. So you move in left anterior, and now we're palpating from that left anterior position, pressing in from this side and seeing where, I'm exaggerating the motion here, but seeing where you feel the resistance of that joint to come back to neutral. You shouldn't see any motion, you just palpate, you feel the resistance. But as you palpate and you feel the resistance of the joint from this position back to neutral, that's where your subluxation is, plain and simple. So why does it sometimes not clear very well? Because we're probably not being precise with the adjusting. If we are able to adjust it exactly back towards neutral, we should see that it does clear. If you're getting 5 cavitations when you're adjusting, then you're not adjusting one joint. We're moving too many things. And also, when we're adjusting, most adjusting is not a translational adjusting. I like Gonstead laterals. I think they're quite good. But again, they're end range. We're trying to just take it from where it's stuck back to neutral. When we rotate a joint, particularly with the cervical break, we're moving it in a biomechanically incorrect way. We're jamming one facet as sort of a brace, and you're gapping the other facet. That's not the way the facet joints are meant to move. They're meant to glide, okay? So the rotary breaks are kind of a cheat, you know? You're really stretching the joint in a way it's not really meant to move. You will get muscles to relax, but we're also very powerfully stretching the muscles that should be resisting that motion to stabilize it. So that might be why it's not clearing. What will happen is after that stretches, if the joint is unstable after the adjustment, then the muscles will tighten up again. And we say sometimes people, oh, they responded badly to an adjustment. It might just be that they were already unstable. And then the adjustment itself could have been further destabilizing the joint. What does the body do when there's a joint that's unstable? Fires off the phasic muscles, the extrinsic muscles. Boom, everything locks up. Like, oh shit, doc, my neck's stuck, right? That's what happens. So sorry for the bad news. I'm not saying that's what you do, but this is something that you can see sometimes. The next question. So from Meli, I hope I said that right. In a P1 test, is there a relevant difference between moving patients head passively on a translation vector versus rotational extension? For example, in a LARP plane. As you mentioned in this section, LARP motion is purely translational. Yes, so thank you. Yes, so what happens in the P1 test is you only have to start moving their head and you get the response. You're not necessarily translating or rotating the head. You're moving them from this position back to a neutral position. When they have that subluxation, they're going to have probably some scalene tension that's going to contract and pull the head into lateral flexion as well. So you're taking them out of that lateral flexion is really what's happening. But that lateral flexion involves that translation. So yes, there is. So so you're asking, is there a difference between moving translationally and rotationally? Yes, but it's still going to give you the same result. It doesn't matter that much. It more matters what's actually happening with the joint. I'll give you another example, is that in the upper cervicals, we have a lot of tilt that can happen as well. So we can actually do the P1 test with the tilt as well. So you tilt them, and then as you bring them back from that tilt, you'll see a similar response. So translation is translation, whether there's a pure translation or whether there's an arc, okay? So in a tilt, you're going to have an arc like this as C1 is gliding over C2, okay? But so it's just that translation that's happening, okay? Whether it's pure translation or any translation, okay? So thanks for that question. So La Toro says, when assessing the vestibular system, otoliths and visual systems through, when assessing vestibular system, otolith, and visual systems through neurologic tests, if you find an issue on any of them that are either hyperactive or hypoactive, taking into account what you mentioned about the mental map, would you prioritize treating vestibular system, for example, first, and adjusting the subluxation or on neutral once the connection is more balanced to make a clearer map, or the other way around would be the same results? So great question, Latoro. I think let me just kind of put it in a slightly different context. What's happening, what you're talking about, is when there's a decalibration in your system. Your system is getting different inputs from your vestibular system or from your proprioceptive system. What I generally find is when we're looking at the otolith, it's generally pretty accurate. Your otolith is not going to go wrong. It's been around for hundreds of millions of years, 400 million years, and it gives pretty good inputs. So it's not going to give bad inputs that often. So unless there's some sensory neural sort of deficit, or some other sort of biological process, but generally that system's going to work pretty well. So if we see a failure, we're gonna lean on the proprioceptive system first, and we can use our P1 test as an indicator of whether that's true or not. In our program, we teach how to separate out the different systems. So you can say, for instance, check someone's proprioceptive system by turning their shoulders, but not their head. So you don't get any vestibular stimulation, but now my neck is turned all the way to the right. Now my neck is turned all the way to the left. Okay, I can't go more left, but I can go right. So we can do little tricks to bias one system or another, and to be able to finally separate them. But in general, I would say that the proprioceptive system can become skewed much more easily than the vestibular system. I'll always fix the proprioceptive system first, and then calibrate the vestibular system. If we don't fix the proprioceptive system, we don't fix the joints, and we try to do some type of vestibular activation or some type of rehab with a mapped out system, which is aberrant, we're now just calibrating the whole system to these joints that aren't moving properly. And then you might get some effect, but you're not really going to resolve things completely. So I would definitely argue to resolve the joints first. Thanks for that question. Let's see. So Bilal says, will you approach patients with EDS the same way? I actually had a really interesting case in Minneapolis about a year or so ago of a woman who had been adjusted a couple of times and left the office in ambulances both times because of her instabilities. And she really wanted to experience adjusting to neutral. I didn't think it was going to be a problem because we're not putting any stress on the ligaments. Just to check her, just to see how she would do. We did an adjusting to neutral adjustment on her lumbar spine the first day. She came back the next day saying her brain switched on. She felt amazing. She felt fantastic. And then she's like, I'm ready for the cervicals. Let's do it. Let's do it. And actually, funny enough, it did switch her system back on. We saw more muscle activation in her stabilizing muscles. We could feel that tone in her neck. So with more tone, it's much easier as well to adjust. So I adjusted her neck and she had a perfect response. There's no problem at all. Her joints are more stable and she felt great. So yes, you can, but obviously you have to consider each case and the risks of each case. But with adjusting to neutral, we're not putting any strain on the ligaments. We're not taking the joint from one position back to a neutral position. If there's any strain on the ligament, you're taking the strain off as you're adjusting. So you're never moving that far to put any strain on the ligaments. Good question, though. Thanks. Next question. Are there more? Or do we need to look in the chats? I think that may have done everything. Monica, is that everything done there? Let's see. Here, someone said, so Monica said, does anyone bring cases they'd like to discuss? If you have any cases, just put your hand up. It's very easy for us to bring you on stage and we can have a conversation as well if you want. So if you want to come on stage and ask a question about a case, please feel free. Just flag that up in the chat. So here in the registration form, someone asked, is it possible to emulate adjusting to neutral with tools like an activator or arthrostim, for example? Yeah, why not? Try it. I don't have those tools. I like adjusting simply because of the feedback I get from someone, but there's no reason why it wouldn't work. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of me giving you this isn't to sell you on the course or anything else. I want to try to give you the things that I've been blessed with, the things that have made a difference in my practice. And the hope is that you can take this and use whatever tools you have at hand. So if you have a activator or arthrosim, absolutely use it. With SOT blocks, anything that's creating a tonic stimulation over time could make a difference. How long a few minutes on SOT blocks is going to make in terms of creating a long-lasting change? Probably not too much. I think what it can do is start to shift the proprioceptive system so that your body hopefully can kind of remap itself. I really like SOT. I was in SOT the whole way through chiropractic school. I think it's an amazing technique. Absolutely nothing against it. I think it does work on the tonic system and it can help to remap. But I would also encourage to look at Cervical stair step is also a really cool technique to kind of wind out some of that tension as well. So just use whatever tools you have at hand. But if we're thinking about where we feel the resistance of the joint to come back to neutral and working on clearing that, then we're definitely going to have better results. Um, so someone else asked, after everything talked about during the past sessions, how do we explain that some patients become pain-free by strengthening their phasic muscles? That's what they tell me outside the chiropractic context. So what happens is when you exercise muscles, so if you're pumping away, you're using phasic muscles. If those muscles are muscles you're using to compensate, you're building more compensation. So it's better to have more compensation than no compensation or less compensation. But remember that compensation is putting load on joints, and it could potentially accelerate the wear and tear of the joints. Um, it's not to say that all exercise is bad, though. I mean, we teach a lot of exercises, but the exercises we're teaching are tonic activation exercises, holding exercises, body weight holding exercises. You know, you could say planking maybe, but doing like deep squats and holding squats. That's awesome. That's really, really awesome because that's just activating your holding muscle fibers. What happens? You're going to drop down. You're going to use whatever muscles you have. And what's going to happen is the phasic muscles are going to run out of steam. You're going to shake and shake and shake. And after a while, it'll slow down. After enough doing it, you're going to be able to hold that position. And that's when you know that you've activated the tonic system. So we use a lot of tonic, we call tonic activation, holding exercises against resistance to activate that tonic system. So exercising is good. Exercise is going to help to stabilize the system. If the system's broken higher up, you got to fix that first. But once you've done that, then you can start to fix the rest of the stuff, and you're going to see some really good long-lasting results. One of the things we teach is that we teach you how to find where that joint is failing, like what is the position that it's failing in, and the vector that that joint is failing in. We're not even looking at the neck anymore. So we can rehabilitate a particular joint in a particular position, in a particular vector with holding exercises. And that will be able to stabilize that joint in that position. So that now when the joint's moving through this position, it'll work properly. I'll give you a quick example. I had one of the top 5 polo players in the world, literally he was in the top 5 polo players in the world, who when he was hitting the ball, in the position of his arm being down where he hits the ball, and this guy is like the most incredible guy in the world, in that position, his arm was at its weakest. We rehabilitated his neck and rebuilt his shoulder and arm function in 30, 40 minutes, and was able to give him better stabilization in that position at the point of impact with the ball. That's where he was weak. So you imagine that if you don't have strength in that position, you can't control the ball very well. And the guy's already at the top. We fixed him. The next day, I watched him play, and he hit the ball into the air. If you've ever seen polo, you have a little mallet. It's about this big, and the ball is a little bit bigger. But it's like he was riding his horse at full speed down the pitch, bouncing the ball like he's juggling like this on the end of the thing, hitting it up about a meter and a half in the air while he's riding a horse at full tilt, hitting this, just juggling it down the thing, riding around other players, and then just knocked it into the goal and got the point. And people just went, what the hell just happened? And I spoke to him afterwards. He was like, yeah, it felt really good. So you can do some really, really cool stuff with paying attention to the tonic system. Right now, we're just talking about the spine, but there's so much more that we can do as well. Yes, I think that answers that question. And someone else wrote here. So with traumatic onset subluxation, so there's more to that question. Actually, someone said, so he also says, especially considering that there are subluxations that keep the joint from functioning in their optimal biomechanics. So again, those tonic muscle fibers are all over our body. Every muscle has a mixture of tonic and phasic fibers. So you can activate specifically tonic fibers consciously too in your extremities. So that's why it's important to activate those, because that's the muscles that are controlling the mechanics of those joints, the mechanics of that muscle, and the control of the biomechanics of that joint. So with traumatic onset subluxation and its resulting compensation patterns, Do you find that compensation pattern may become subluxations with subsequent traumas? So does the compensation become a subluxation? Um, I don't know, it's kind of a tricky way of looking at it, but I would say that um, if you have a subluxation, you'll probably have a compensation. If you don't have a subluxation, you shouldn't have a compensation. So I don't think so. But what I could say is that if you've had a compensation for a period of time and you end up developing changes in the muscle function, you have adhesions in the muscle or some other muscle failure, then that muscle failure could result of these essentially extrinsic muscles we're talking about now. Could that create a subluxation? Yes, it's foreseeable that it could as well. So that's a good question. Thank you. So if there's no more, we'll just wrap up with that. Again, just want to thank you all for joining. It's been a lot of fun for me. I hope it's been. Oh wait, so Monica says there's an error in the link for the registration form, so she's just going to send that again. So let's just maybe stick around until that's done. But you also get emails as well. And if you want to go to the foundations.adjustandneutral page, you'll see that. So hopefully that's all working well. Thanks for all the thank yous. Appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in, guys. And we'll be coming back in 2 weeks with the next module. And we're going to be talking a lot more about the practical applications of this. So not just from a adjusting to neutral perspective, but using the kind of tools that you would have at hand, things you've been trained to do. Because again, I'm not trying to sell you on adjusting neutral. It'd be great if you join the course, but the focus of what we're doing here is to bring you things that you can bring into your daily practice. And I think the first key step is just understanding what's going on and being able to use the tools that are in your drawer, that are in your hands, to be able to bring that to your patients the best way that you can. So with that, again, I'll say thank you very much. I think what we're going to do is try to keep it open for, let's see, Monica, you can hear me. Is the link working well now? Monica,
yeah, it's the same link, but you just have to refresh the page and try again.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Sorry about that, guys.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining in, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Okay. Thanks a lot. Take care.